Right. Well, hey everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Kalyb and I use she, her pronouns. Just a little bit about me. I live in LA. My day job is at an animal rights organization where I'm a coordinator and advisor for our student activist program, just building up and empowering young activists to fight speciesism. I also care deeply about social and racial justice and consistent anti-oppression activism, and I know that you all share those values. So I'm really excited to meet with you all, and today I'm going to speak just a bit on defunding the police. So you may be wondering, like, who the heck is this woman and why is she speaking on this topic? And that's a good question. I know that as a white woman, I am not a representative voice on this issue or qualified to speak from experience. I'm just sharing what I've learned about this with you. Kitty reached out to me about this, I think after she heard that I gave a similar presentation to Wayne's mayoral campaign, because I help a little bit with policy issues. So of course I wanted to take the opportunity to meet all of you and share what I've learned and also share my ideas on how this relates to the animal liberation movement. So first I'll talk about what it means when people say defund the police, and then I'll discuss why this is what we have to do, how it will help people, especially those in marginalized communities. And after that, I'll share a few of my thoughts on how this issue relates to our movement and open it up for discussion. All right, so when people say defund the police, what they mean is really three things. So first, let's redirect massive police budget funds into community services and stop expecting the police to respond to every type of call for service, especially when they aren't needed nor trained for handling those calls. So that requires creating new alternative crisis response teams and new departments to handle non-emergencies like traffic stops, for example. It also means let's demilitarize the remaining police by getting military-style weapons out of their hands and end military-style training programs. I'll dive a bit deeper into each of these points. So first, refunding the community. While law enforcement budgets might not need to be reduced to absolute zero, they have gotten to such extreme, unjustifiable levels that it's a no-brainer to at least defund a large part of police budgets. So let me start with an example. The poster child for police overspending is, unfortunately, my city of Los Angeles. Over half of all our unrestricted spending in the city is directed to law enforcement. And there are two main reasons for this, in my view. First off, politicians realized in the 90s that a get tough on crime approach was a political winner. And the most obvious way to signal their crime-fighting virtues was to simply increase the police budget. And although this political sentiment may be fading in modern times, a second, more persistent reason for police overspending is the existence of powerful police unions. And you can see the union influence on display in the city budget graph here, even where the share of spending on police and fire is highlighted in big block letters, like you can't miss it. Unions also influence politics through super PAC-like independent expenditure commissions, which advertise on behalf of candidates. So in LA alone, over the past decade, unions have spent millions in local political races, sometimes being the largest contributor in a race. It's also important to note that unions actively coach their members on who to vote for and are quite successful at rallying members and their families to polls on election days. So all of these political levers have allowed unions to steadily increase spending on equipment and benefits for officers, largely to the detriment of other social services, which do not have powerful unions backing their workers. However, LA is not the only city which overspends on their police force. You may not be surprised to hear that other major cities like Chicago, which spends 37% of their budget, or Atlanta, which spends 30%, also have out of control police spending. And even in smaller cities like Mobile, Alabama, they overspend as well. About 20% of their budget goes to police. So to sum it up, overfunding police budgets is sort of like a quid pro quo for elected officials, right? In return, they get campaign donations from police unions. And this leads to district attorneys failing to prosecute killer cops. It also leads to other elected officials like city council members and mayors continuing to increase the police budget each year to keep the union happy and to keep the campaign contributions flowing. So a huge step for racial justice would be to redirect those police budget dollars, which are normally used to violently oppress Black and Indigenous people of color, into affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, and homelessness services, because Black and Indigenous people of color are also disproportionately affected by homelessness. they're grossly overrepresented in the unhoused population, as you can see from these charts. And the effects of shifting money in this way away from an oppressive and deadly force, the cops, and investing it into vital resources for those oppressed people. And for those who would object to defunding the police over fears that crime would increase, it's really the opposite. And that's because refunding health and social services reduces crime in effect. So nonviolent interventions, for example, the Becoming a Man program, reduced violent crime by half. And in Chicago, they found that having more civilian security guards or unarmed officers resulted in a reduction in violent crime. Now, separately, a study by economist Jacob Volger found access to healthcare helps too. So he found there was a 5% reduction in crime due to the expansion of Medicaid. So the point is that refunding these areas helps create a more equitable society for those who lack access to such resources, which disproportionately are people of color. All right, moving on. So we need to stop expecting the police to respond to every single problem. Very few situations really require armed men to show up on scene. The first step is creating alternative emergency response services other than the police, especially for mental health emergencies. So on the left, you see two responders in Fort Collins, Colorado, and they're trained in dealing with mental health emergencies. One is a therapist and one's a paramedic. And the local newspaper wrote of the Fort Collins Alternative Response Program that anyone you ask at the police department calls this program a success at connecting people to resources and preventing unnecessary trips to jail and the ER. So this work is also life-saving. People with mental illnesses are 16 times more likely to be killed by the police in an emergency response. And so that's why we want care, not cops, especially in situations involving mental health. But we also want to get armed police officers out of as many situations as possible, including things like traffic stops. So on that vein, typical traffic accidents and speeding violations, they never require cops with guns, right? And introducing a gun in the situation only makes people less safe. We've all seen dash cam footage of traffic stops gone horribly wrong, which could obviously be prevented by an unarmed response. So in practice, this would look like unarmed employees of the Department of Transportation carrying out routine traffic stops similar to how your local parking authority already operates. And this new class of officers would have the authority to write tickets, but not be able to perform arrests, would not detain citizens, and of course, they wouldn't carry weapons. Such a program has been proposed in Berkeley, but doesn't seem like they're serious about implementing it. They've proposed a 1-year timeline. Hopefully, though, with a new mayor, that will change. Another more futuristic way to enforce certain traffic laws would be with an entirely camera-based system, which would capture people speeding or running stop signs and red lights. And that might conflict with Americans' notions of privacy rights, but the system would be much less racially biased than allowing human officers to decide who gets ticketed. All right, number 3, demilitarizing the police. So as we've all seen from recent Black Lives Matter protests, the police are extremely militarized in terms of both equipment and tactics. Although the police have always had a resemblance to the military, for example, their hierarchical change of command and the physical training, the level of militarization that we see today is a very recent trend. In fact, there's a specific Department of Defense program started under the Clinton administration, which is to blame, at least for the military-grade equipment. This program is known as the Law Enforcement Support Office, and it's sometimes referred to just as the 1033 program. Okay, so it started under Clinton's Get Tough on Crime policies, but it actually expanded a lot under the Obama administration. Perversely, this was the consequence of Obama's attempts to get Americans overseas wars to end those, and that produced a glut of military equipment. So that's why that was all redirected to local law enforcement. No matter the reason, though, the fact is that it added 100,000 machine guns to the streets as a result of the program, and it's hard to say how that makes us safer. Now, the military-style equipment that police have acquired is very visible and quite obvious to the casual observer. However, they have also been training themselves with military-style tactics, which are potentially just as dangerous to our communities. And so while this is a national program, local governments absolutely have the power to choose not to accept these weapons. So just as one example, in Berkeley, the police department used to participate in a military-style training program called Urban Shield up until around 2019. In Berkeley, a city with a population of 120K. So this is not the right direction for our police. You know, they should be headed in the direction of public safety and not military. What it means, let's move on to why we need to defund the police. So why should we do it? It's simple, really. The police are given an unbelievable amount of public resources and use them to violently oppress Black and Indigenous people of color and uphold racist systems. So in other words, we're giving a lot of our limited resources to an evil system, yet we have enormous unaddressed need in other areas of our society. So it comes down to, we should defund to, one, help alleviate the violence and discrimination that people of color face, and two, invest in vital resources for those communities. I also want to establish that defunding the police is not a radical concept. Full-time cops are a relatively recent creation. The first city police force was only established in 1838, and in many cases, these forces and their predecessors began as racist institutions. One of the first formal law enforcement groups was established to return enslaved people to their oppressors in the Carolinas in the 1700s. Those groups proliferated around southern US, and by the early 1800s, it was city police enforcing slavery. So it was natural for those police forces to later enforce Jim Crow laws and segregation to suppress and intimidate protesters, as you see on the slide here, and in very recent times to wage the war on drugs and profit from communities of color with frivolous charges. So no violent racist institution has a place in our society. Right, so police violence is also a huge public health issue, which disproportionately, of course, affects Black Americans. The American Public Health Association has identified police violence as a critical area of public health research, which it clearly is. And the horrifying reality is that 1 in 1,000 Black men are killed by police, a rate 3 times higher than white men. Policymakers should be concerned about any threat that kills their citizens, especially one that kills this many people. So the public health consequences of over-policing are yet another reason why defunding the police is not just possible, but it's logical. Okay, so the final reason I want to talk about for defunding the police, although there are many, is that police officers, they don't even spend most of their time keeping communities safe in the way that you would expect. Only 5% of the 10.3 million annual arrests are for serious offenses like murder or aggravated assault. Many arrests are frivolous and simply a means to oppress Americans of color. For example, the landmark 2014 DOJ report on policing in Ferguson found that one of the charges where Blacks were cited more often than whites was manner of walking, which is issued to Black people 95% of the time, which is basically like, it's just racial profiling. And the police reform policy should include decriminalization of frivolous crimes like jaywalking and bans on spitting in public, which, like manner of walking in Ferguson, are almost exclusively used to oppress people of color. All right, so this was published in the New York Times pretty recently, I think last month, and they found that police don't even spend much of their time responding to violent crime, like I mentioned. Only about 4% of their calls are responding to violent crime. Much more time spent on minor incidents like traffic violations and non-criminal complaints. And that's not just for the 3 cities you see here. For example, in Seattle, traffic accidents this year made up 15% of all calls for service. And so, as I said before, a lot of activists are calling for these types of nonviolent calls to be handled by social workers or other novel emergency response workers instead of having armed cops respond to them. Okay, so we've covered what and why, so let's move on to the effects that we hope to see if we're able to accomplish defunding the police. So how will it help? Well, the most obvious and important effect would be a reduction in incidents of police brutality and murders. Like I said before, Black and Indigenous people of color are murdered at extremely high rates by the police. 1 in 1,000 Black men will be killed by the cops in the US. And again, that's 3 times higher than white people. but it would also help control the exploding prison population. In California alone, there are 35 state prisons, so that's not even counting county jails, juvenile detention facilities, or federal prisons in the state. Now, 92% of those state prisons have more prisoners than the design maximum capacity, so there's this massive overcrowding issue. We know the US has a mass incarceration problem on the national level, and California is no exception. So not only is mass incarceration a civil and human rights issue, but it's also a massive waste of resources. Reducing the prison population, or more accurately, I guess, stagnating expansion of the prison population would have a direct impact on people of color and their communities. And that's partly because of how extremely overrepresented people of color are in the prison population. So in California, for example, adult Black men make up less than 6% of the population, yet they are 26% of the state prison population. And their imprisonment rate is 10 times higher than their white counterparts. So obviously this has huge ramifications on communities of color. So it would in turn reduce the amount of the public's budget spent on incarceration, which would free up resources to be used elsewhere. I'm using the state of California as an example here, but this applies at every level of government. So ideally, we would redirect most of that funding into social services and a Green New Deal to help fight the effects of climate change, which we know disproportionately affects people of color. Finally, it seems like a somewhat obvious conclusion, and I touched a bit on this in the beginning of the presentation, but research from the Brennan Center indicates that transitioning spending from law enforcement to public services decreases crime too, because crime is a result of unaddressed need. So their research relates to nonprofits, which are obviously limited in their capacity to provide services at scale, but governments definitely could provide services at scale and possibly have an even bigger effect on crime rates. But regardless, if money spent on public services could have the same effect or a better effect than police spending, it makes sense that that's where we should shift our funding. Okay, so that is all I will say about the benefits of defunding the police for now, but I do encourage you all to jump in with thoughts at the end. So the last thing I want to talk about before that, though, is how defunding the police can be advantageous to our movement. So I have a few thoughts on how this is related to the animal liberation movement, and I'll briefly share those and open up the floor. So many activists are people of color. They are vital members of our community. And if we can mitigate this huge threat that they face in their everyday lives, it's obviously a good enough reason to do it. And I think that an additional benefit would be that if activists didn't have to worry so much about cops in their day-to-day life, they would have more energy to spend on activism. So another thing is prison labor and animal agriculture. Prison labor is inherently exploitative, and several of California's state prisons have animal agriculture labor programs. So using prison labor for dairy, meat processing, poultry, egg production, the list goes on. So reducing the amount of cheap prison labor available to the animal agriculture industry can do nothing but help our cause. So an indirect effect that I noticed would be redirecting funding from all levels of government, including the police, into a Green New Deal would help the movement because we're all affected by the climate crisis, including wildlife. Additionally, a Green New Deal can include shifting our food system to a plant-based one, which would prevent billions of animal slaughters. Okay, so right now, most calls for service related to animals are answered by animal control, which is typically a division of local police departments. And I feel like fully funding a new team that would respond to calls for service related to animals would ensure better enforcement of animal welfare, cruelty, and neglect laws. So as you all know too well, animal control officers who respond to these calls usually say they found nothing wrong or they found no abuse, no neglect for animals. But if we had a sufficiently funded team with vets or vet techs, people who care about animals, responding to these calls for service, I suspect that more action would be taken against animal cruelty and neglect, and these laws would be better enforced, and some animals' quality of life would improve across the board. Obviously, this only applies to the weak animal cruelty laws that do exist, which exclude most species, as we know, but I think this has the potential to help a lot of animals regardless.